Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Monk. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology here. Thanks so much for coming out. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Fryberg. So Dr. Stephanie Fryberg is a professor in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Michigan. Prior to arriving here, she was a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, as well as a professor at the University of Arizona. Stephanie did her undergraduate work at Kenyon College, and she received her PhD in social psychology at Stanford University. Stephanie's research has three foci. First, she seeks to understand how culture influences educational attainment, and she also conducts interventions designed to improve educational outcomes for diverse student groups. Second, she examines cultural processes that contribute to racial bias. And third, she explores how culture shapes the ways in which people make meaning from adverse life experiences. She has received impressive grants from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and the National Science Foundation, among others. She also received many awards for research, including the University Diversity, the University Diversity and Social Transformation Professorship from the University of Michigan. At the University of Washington, she received the William and Ruth Gerberding University Professorship, and she was named a Fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. The title for Dr. Stephanie Fryberg's talk is Omission as the Modern Form of Bias Against Indigenous People. Here is Dr. Stephanie Fryberg.
Well, good evening. Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for coming out tonight. It's a little chilly out there, so I appreciate you all making the trip. I'm really excited to share my work with you, and it's work that we've been doing at the RISE Center, which is a new center that started in the last 2 years. RISE stands for Research for Indigenous Social Action and Equity, and the center is very much about looking at both how we can unpack the ways in which the omission of Indigenous people, which you'll learn more about today, impact well-being, experiences of discrimination, all of this. But we also, I think, uniquely work with artists and with social activists to get research out there to help them do the work they're doing, but also to think about the ways in which we can create modern forms of art that alleviate modern representations of Indigenous people. And so it's been such an amazing pleasure to work with people at the center and to be a part of this organization. So today, I want to start with a quote from Jerome Bruner. So Jerome Bruner says, if we can learn how culture makes mind, perhaps we can make cultures which make better, more fulfilled minds. This idea that we can leverage cultural change to improve psychological outcomes is especially important within the context of Indigenous peoples and the ongoing process of settler colonialism. The United States is a settler colony whose very essence required usurping the land and oppressing the social and cultural structures of the original inhabitants of this country, the Indigenous people, Native Americans in particular, who resided here since time immemorial. In order to carry out and maintain this process, settlers and their descendants have long engaged in both the literal and figurative, and here we can think about erasure and dehumanization of Indigenous peoples. This is evident in the historical narratives about our nation that often bemoan the wrongdoings of historical Indigenous peoples and uphold partial truths that reify an American identity characterized by morality, righteousness, and a general belief that we stand up to injustice. Throughout this talk, I will make the case that the process of settler colonialism continues in our core cultural ideas, practices, and social interactions, and that ultimately this process constitutes the modern form of bias that undermines Indigenous well-being. I will also go one step further to demonstrate how Indigenous people continue to push back against this process to create an American culture that is less oppressive and more fulfilling for contemporary Indigenous peoples going forward. So contemporary Indigenous people are omitted from multiple domains. So if we start with the media, few, if any, contemporary Indigenous representations exist. I want to be clear, that's actually changing. We've seen real change in the last couple of years, something that really is a part of the work that RISE has been doing. We've been partnering with organizations. We do the research. Illuminative and Native Organizers Alliance take it to Hollywood. They take it to the political sphere. And, so we're just the silent part of this partnership. But what we're really seeing is that change is happening. And so prior to these last couple of years, research has consistently showed that less than 0.5% of media representations portray contemporary Indigenous people. Moreover, for a long time, if you did a search of Google or back in the day Bing, only 5% of the first 100 images that came up portrayed contemporary Indigenous people. In fact, if you look down below, most often what you would see were sort of Wild West, pre-1900 context imagery. And it's very much the case that if it was somewhat contemporary, it was Edward Curtis's art that would come up. And what people don't often know about his work is that while he traveled to Indigenous communities, he asked people in those communities to dress the way he envisioned them, which means that there were often Native people in the Southwest who were dressed like Plains Indians, or Plains Indians who were dressed like coastal Indians. And so it isn't an accurate representation of Native people in that time period. Across 2 national samples, we found that more than 80% of non-Native people reported not being able to name a famous living Native American. Right, 80%. Now, it's not that we're not out there, and it's not that there aren't people out there doing great work. It's that where people learn is in education, which takes us to the next part of it. So research by Sarah Shears and colleagues shows that 87% of references to Native Americans in 50 states' academic standards portray Native people in a pre-1900 context. And this work is so important, in part because, I really love Sarah's work, in part because what she's capturing is what people hold in their mind, right? So if as young people we're only exposed to these pre-1900 contexts, then we might hypothesize that Americans today are likely to have a bias that we are historical figures. And so we ran in a national sample, across 2 samples, we asked information about contemporary Native Americans, and study participants responded, "I don't know," more than 50% of the time. In fact, our first attempt at this, we used multiple choice, and people had a better chance guessing than they did actually answering. And then we made it true or false, and people got it right less than 50% of the time. And what we did is start out by picking out the most commonly talked about ideas that were out there. But part of the problem is, what is truth? And I think it's something that we'll talk about today as we go through this presentation. Also, the social sciences are certainly not omitted to this bias. So we find that when we looked at 40,000 peer-reviewed papers on prejudice, stereotyping, and intergroup relations, only 0.5% of them mentioned Native Americans, not included, just mentioned Native Americans in that script. And then within that, 0.2% actually had Native participants. And I can assure you that most of the people doing that work are in this room right now. So there's a real issue because we use social science in the law. We use it to make cases. We use science to make arguments. And for the most part, science has omitted Indigenous people. And we could have a whole presentation on why that is true. And I'm happy to say that here at Michigan, we are changing that. So we have a number within the psych department, we have a number of Indigenous PhD students who are going to go on to be these people. And in fact, again, many of them are in this room. And so it's one of the things that, in my desire as a senior scholar to change the field is because I also want to change the conversation, right? We need to create the kind of science that is out there that will allow the needs, wants, desires of Indigenous people to be met and heard. So consequently, what we find is that when we don't include Native people in the discussion about prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, it's the case that people minimize Native people's experiences with racism and discrimination. In fact, the research shows that 75% of Native people report experiencing discrimination, but only 34% of Americans believe that Natives experience discrimination. The differential for African Americans in this country is less than 10%. People both believe that they report experiencing discrimination, and people believe that they experience discrimination. Okay, now let's be really clear, right? This is an issue, first and foremost, of we have to solve the problem of people experiencing it. But what we know is that if people don't think that you're experiencing it, they also don't think there's a problem that needs to be attended to. Okay, so why does this matter? Social or public representation shape how people think, feel, and subsequently act towards Indigenous people. Indigenous people are often omitted from key conversations across various consequential societal domains. And omission influences what Indigenous children see as possible for themselves and what others see as possible for them, right? So we all go through a process of negotiating our identities. Everybody does. We all look out in the world to see how our group is represented, and that becomes part of the process of developing a self. And so when your group is consistently omitted from that conversation, it requires a different process to engage to figure out what it means to be an contemporary Indigenous person. And that gets more complicated if you live in urban contexts, if your family is removed from your Indigenous community. It might be more difficult if you want to go back and forth between contexts. But all of this to say that this process is dependent on what the representations are that exist in society. And so today I will argue that omission, the lack of contemporary representations across numerous domains, constitutes the modern form of bias against Indigenous peoples. To support this claim, I will present evidence demonstrating that 1, omission perpetuates bias and discrimination. 2, omission undermines Indigenous people's psychological well-being. And 3, Indigenous people are pushing back against omission. So I want to start by just going over some earlier studies. We have 3 studies that reveal that when contemporary representations of Indigenous people are omitted from the public consciousness, non-Indigenous people report less warmth towards Indigenous people, greater dehumanization of Indigenous people, greater opposition to policies aimed at Indigenous equity, such as protecting sovereignty rights, rectifying resource inequality, teaching accurate history, right? All of these are policies that we measured. So across 3 studies, we saw a consistent relationship between our measure of omission and perceptions of Native people. In particular, we found that the omission of Indigenous people from educational contexts, as demonstrated by a lack of knowledge about Native people, and the omission of Native people from news media, is related to people being more likely to believe that Natives are people of the past. And so we've now developed a number of ways of measuring people of the past, and you will see that through this talk. So similarly, these measures of omission are also related to people minimizing Natives' experiences of racism and discrimination. And again, it's all of these omission measures that are holding up across these 2 variables. So these beliefs stemming from omission shape support for broad policies and specific important issues affecting Native people. I'm going to make this case in 3 domains. First, what is the role of shaping broad policy support? So we had the opportunity to work with Project Implicit at Harvard. So they've been studying implicit attitudes in a variety of domains for decades. So it turned out that they were receiving a lot of criticism about the Native IAT, implicit attitude test. And the reason is that they used historical images in order to prompt people to think about Natives. And so they asked our team if we could help them develop a contemporary measure. So we did, and then we tested it using their research site. And so what we found is using 3 national samples, we found that, Natives compared to whites are seen as people of the past versus contemporary. And in fact, so each of these is one of the national samples, and each of them had 1,000 people in them. And if you take the above the 0 line, right, it means you have this positive bias towards Native people as people of the past. 80 to 85% of our samples held the bias that Native people were people of the past. So just to put that in a big context, right? I mean, Native people, not only are we here, there's 11 million of us in this country, but we're also one of the fastest growing groups in this country. And so there isn't evidence that, in fact, we're going away. If anything, we've been growing. I mean, there was certainly a time period in this country of tremendous, dare I say, genocide of Native people, right? The sort of pushing south, the spreading of disease, right? The taking of land, killing of the entire tribe, right? So this goes on for a long time. And we are decimated in many different ways across the country. But we aren't killed off, right? So, I mean, I grew up in my tribal community. I grew up around my family. It's a very common experience, but there are also large urban Native communities that have developed. So the relocation of Native people to the city merely meant that there were these pan-Indian communities that came together and continued to have ceremonies, right? So they changed, but nonetheless, the identity is still important and salient. And so here we then took this test, right? So we took this bias and we put it into a larger model. And so we found that the more people hold the belief that Natives are people of the past, as indexed by the IAT, the more they also minimized Native people's experiences with racism, which in turn was related to greater opposition to policies aimed at Indigenous equity. Right, so we're really setting up a model here, and I'm going to show you this model holds over and over. And it's an important model because you see that how we represent contemporary people matters. Because again, it isn't just about how I as an Indigenous person see those representations, it's also about how I engage other people's representations. What do people see in me in that social interaction? So, beyond these broad implications of people of the past perceptions and racism minimization, these beliefs stemming from omission also have implications for specific instances of injustice facing Natives. Take, for example, the persistence of redface relative to blackface. A recent poll by Pew Research Center revealed that a slight majority of Americans believe that dressing up as another race is generally unacceptable. This is not surprising given that historically dressing in redface and blackface was used as a tool of oppression. Relying on caricatures and negative stereotypes to portray Native and Black people, what is surprising is that we continue to see these behaviors and representations persist across many domains of American society. And so I just want to give a shout out. My grad student, Julissa, this is her publication, her first publication in grad school. And, you know, I give that shout out because a lot of work goes into every one of these. And what you'll see in the next slide is that, in fact, we have 5 studies in this paper. And so across 5 studies, between subjects, within subjects. So meaning, right, between subjects, like, so we're talking about whether we have the same person see both conditions, red face and black face, or whether we have people only assigned to see one of them, whether we assign them to see pictures or give them vignettes. This holds, that people consistently see red face as more acceptable than blackface. Now, we find that this differential acceptability is explained by differences in the extent to which, compared to Black people, Native people are viewed as people of the past, which in turn leads to racism, minimization, and the acceptability of racialized representations. Okay, so at this point, you should be seeing the same variables are coming up, and we're seeing the same process. And if you're someone in this room who's real stats savvy, you could say, well, maybe we would flip those variables in the center. This direction of people of the past to racism minimization, we get consistent results. If we flip it, right, and certainly they're correlational studies, if we flip it in this case, we get inconsistent results. So, similarly, we see these two variables as relevant to the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. To put this epidemic in perspective, I want to offer a few statistics from a recent report in the US. So the murder rate of Native American women is almost 3 times that of non-Hispanic white women. In 1 year, 5,721 Native American women went missing, but only 116 of the cases were recorded in the Department of Justice Missing Persons Database, and 5% of those 116 were covered by national media. So of the perpetrators caught, 83% were male and over half were non-Native. And in fact, when you look at violence against Native women, one of the things that you see is that we're the one group in this country for whom the violence inflicted upon women is largely at the hands of out-group members. So across most groups, the majority is an in-group member. So the question we're asking is, what are the psychological factors contributing to the limited support and resources for MMIWG? So our team is really concerned with understanding the apathy that exists, right? So if you break down those numbers, literally every day in this country, Indigenous women go murdered and missing every day, right? Could be right now. And for the most part, you don't see it on the news. Every once in a while, a case will make the news, but it shouldn't be that way, right? I mean, there are artists, Native Indigenous artists, who ask this question all the time. How can you say that you see us as equally human when you can't hear the cries of our women? And I think it's a really powerful message. In fact, across the 2 studies that we've collected, we see that the more people view Indigenous people as people of the past, the more they minimize Indigenous people's experiences of racism, which shapes how people view the MMIWG crisis. In addition, right, so here we go again down the center, greater racism minimization is related to greater blaming of victims and less blaming of society, both of which are driving apathy for MMIWG, and subsequently are related to less support for resources aimed at ending the crisis. And so again, it comes back to this issue. If you think that we are not contemporary, right, then these issues are not real issues, right? It's easy to dismiss. It's easy to feel apathetic, right? I mean, if we really aren't here, then what is, why do we have to attend to this? And so that, as a piece of settler colonialism, that erasure has historically been the tool, and we continue to see it be the tool, right? We erase and we dehumanize. So our women's lives, our children's lives are not equal to those of other women in this country. And in fact, we have fewer protections. And that's especially true if you live in a tribal community. Okay, so I have made the case in the first part of this talk that Indigenous omission reinforces people of the past perceptions both explicitly and implicitly, right? So through explicit measures where we're asking on surveys, but also through the implicit measure where we're capturing implicit attitudes. So second, if this is true and this model holds, what effect does it have on Indigenous people? And so omission, I will argue that omission undermines Indigenous people's psychological well-being. And so in an early study, so first, I guess to start with the top, so there's a 15-year-old Indigenous girl who lives in Chicago, and she was asked by her teacher to write 6 words that represented her. And she wrote 2 words, same meaning, Indigenous, invisible. So as a psychologist, I think about the words of this teenager, and I have to ask, right? What does it mean for her psychological well-being? What does it mean that when asked this question about who she is, for her to come up with these words, right? It suggests that she's seeing the world in a way that those representations, right? And in her process of development, those representations are having an adverse effect. And in fact, in the first ever large Indigenous Futures survey, which we collected 6,400 Native people's responses, 87% said, I feel that the average American does not care about the experiences of Native people. And 77% of our sample said, I feel that the average American thinks there are no real Native Americans left. So we're talking about representations that are being broadly held by Indigenous people in this country. They feel the invisibility. They feel the apathy. And so, in fact, we went on to develop a model, right? And to really look at what is the impact for Indigenous people. So as documented in part 1, omissions perpetuate discrimination. So perceptions of discrimination are linked to poor psychological well-being. That's true for all racial ethnic minority groups in this country, right? So it's especially true for Indigenous people. So the question is do omissions, right? So we know that overt and tangential representations of discrimination that exist have adverse effect. But what about this idea of just simply being left out of the conversation, of being omitted from contemporary life? And so do omissions and misrepresentations impact Indigenous people's well-being through perceptions of discrimination? So we started this by first developing measures that we refer to as sensitivity to omission and sensitivity to misrepresentation. And so we struggled with the word sensitivity, right? Because there's sort of that like, oh, you're just being too sensitive. But that's not what we mean here. It's really how aware are you of Natives being misrepresented? How aware are you? So how much do you recognize and have negative feelings about the lack of representation or about the misrepresentation of your group, which also helps us to understand, right? Native people are not a monolith. And so we've seen a variety of issues come up where there's variation among our community, as there would be any other community. So can we explain it? And so we had the theory, again, there are grad students in this room who are part of this project, but we had this theory that in fact, it's how much we are aware of it that is going to predict psychological well-being. And in fact, what we found is that we tested the following model across 2 national samples, and actually it ends up being 3 national samples. And our paper, which is out under review, has 15,000 Native people in it. And we had 8 forms across the 3 study, 8 forms of psychological well-being. So if you look on the right side, psychological distress, life satisfaction, anxiety, depression, suicide ideation, right? And the data you see here is for suicide ideation, okay? But the pattern holds. And so rather than go into every single one, I'm gonna give you the overall pattern. So we found consistent direct effects. So sensitivity of omission, sensitivity of misrepresentation directly to psychological well-being, okay? It's true for each of them individually. We also found that these relations were at least in part explained by greater perceptions of discrimination. So if I think that the world is omitting me, right, and I'm sensitive to that, I'm also more apt to think that I'm being discriminated against, right? To see it as systemic, to see it as something out there in the world that's having that effect. And so that the study across those three showed that omission shapes perceptions of discrimination, which in turn undermine well-being. And in the final part of this talk, I want to talk about the ways in which Indigenous people are pushing back against omission. I mean, we are absolutely working hard to be seen and to be heard. So I want to start with the election, right? So on election night, when reporting on voter demographics, CNN used a graphic that identified white, Latino, Black, and Asian voters, but lumped Native voters into and they did unfortunately use the term something else category. Okay. By not mentioning Native voters at all, CNN completely omitted the fact that Native communities put in significant effort to increase voter turnout, voted in record-breaking numbers, and were crucial in deciding the election outcomes. In fact, when you look at the states that had big impact, Wisconsin, Arizona, right? Native Organizers Alliance was in those states for months. And we know from looking at the data that Native people influenced the outcomes in Georgia, in a number of the really consequential states. So what does it mean, right? Well, it turns out that within minutes, I mean, it was, I'm on Native Twitter, I'm on Native Facebook. I mean, within minutes, imagery is just flying across the country. And what people are saying is, well, ain't that something else? I'm Native. No, slap in the face, you're something else. So the incident of omission sparked outrage among Natives. One collection of mocking memes were shared on Facebook over 20,000 times in the 12 hours following the release of the graphic. Moreover, influential Native organizations such as Native American Journalists Association, Native Organizers Alliance, and Illuminate spoke up online and in print media, criticizing the something else label. Not only does the CNN example serve as a pointed example of the omission of Natives from the public consciousness, but it also demonstrates that omissions galvanize action aimed at rectifying the problem and changing the status quo among Natives. In fact, right, as shown in the literature, and so I'm going to both show you what we already knew and then what is different. So greater Native identification is related to more civic engagement, and you would find that with other groups too. If being a member of your ethnic group is really important to you, you're more likely to go out there and vote and to work to galvanize the vote. We looked at civic engagement in a couple of different ways. It holds across whether we're asking, right, because some of this data is collected during a pandemic, and the pandemic definitely influenced people's ability to get out. But we asked about their behaviors 5 years ago. We asked about their behaviors at that time. And we also asked about future behavioral intentions. And so what we see is we highlighted a novel predictor and its recognition of Native omission. So greater Native identification is related to greater recognition of omission, which shapes perceived discrimination and civic engagement. Thus, in the current work, we aim to unpack Native civic engagement in relation to these other variables. And so just taking kind of a broad look at this for people who maybe are not statistically savvy, right? We see the many different ways in which this model plays out, but it also, again, helps us to understand something about the ways in which Native communities are not monolithic, right? So people, when I'm in my tribal community, there are people who've grown up in the community and don't engage in any cultural activities, really they don't go and vote, they don't do anything, but they're identified as being Native. And then there are Native people who are all about being in community. And what this speaks to is that those things matter, right? And if I am someone who is highly identified, I'm engaged, I'm going to cultural events, I'm, participating in community, I'm also the one who's going to be more sensitive to being omitted, more sensitive to being misrepresented, because that identity is more central to who I am. And it's not in any way a judgment, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways to be Indigenous in the 21st century. But what is important about it is that it helps us to understand the different experiences that contemporary Indigenous people are having. And so we have this particular set of study. There's actually 3 studies. Again, this paper has 12,000 Indigenous people in it. These are never before seen numbers, but I'll also tell you just kind of a funny story. So we have a revise and resubmit for the second time on this paper. But on the first one, the reviewers' comments, they loved the paper, which was really nice. But one of the reviewers went out of their way to see what was the largest sample of Native people ever in a study, right? And determined that it was about 4,500, okay? And so the person went on to rave about the fact that we more than doubled that in our study. But in the end, they conclude that we needed another study. And so it's just ironic. So we collected another study, we did that. So I think it now is something like 12 or 13,000 Natives. But, right, all in all, we make some important points here. Highly identified Indigenous people engage in more civic action. And being omitted in society may be a critical component of Indigenous people's understanding of the discrimination that their group faces. Okay, so I want to end by returning to Bruner, right? So Bruner talks about what it means to make a more just future, right? So he says that a future with better and more fulfilled minds, we must begin by revealing the processes that keep us from moving forward, and we must work to be seen for who we really are and to be acknowledged for the contributions Native people are making both within our communities and in society at large. Okay, so I want to argue that right here, I think that we've demonstrated that the modern form of bias against Indigenous people is the omission of contemporary representations of the ways in which Indigenous people contribute to society. Right? Societal change requires infusing the broader cultural context with more accurate contemporary representations that are defined by Indigenous people. Well, we're already doing that. So this is the work of Matika Wilbur. She's known around the world. You can follow her. She's got a great TED Talk. She's been doing essentially the Edward Curtis project, but actually asking Indigenous people living in community, in urban environments, how do you want to be seen? And so these are contemporary Indigenous people choosing to be seen the way they want to be seen as contemporary people. And I think it's beautiful. I love her work. So Indigenous people and communities have already begun leveraging this change. We're seeing huge changes in Hollywood. We're seeing huge changes in politics, in particular with women, Native women in politics. Tribes are leveraging this change. 93% of federally and state recognized tribes have tribal justice systems, their own, created by their community, right, with their own legal systems. They vary people love to make comments about tribes don't X. You cannot say that sentence because every tribe developed their own legal system, right? I worked with my tribe for 3 years to rewrite our family and child code to make it child-centered. And I know through my experiences working with my tribe on the Indian Child Welfare Act that we can give our children something that they can never get in a state system. And we can give an answer to who they are. And so tribes have developed systems designed to protect the social, cultural, and emotional needs of Indigenous children. The Violence Against Women Act, tribes have been fighting to protect women and children, to charge non-natives for committing violence against Native women and children. And tribes across the country are building schools and language revitalization programs, not to mention a huge commitment to the environment. Tribes around the country have put in tremendous efforts to get this country to care more about the space you live in. And so I want to end today by saying the onus for changing these representations does not rest solely on Indigenous people. And I want to go back to the earlier point. This is about how we want to be seen, but it's also about how you choose to see us. And that's something we can make the argument, we can put the data out there, but at the end of the day, you have to want to see it too, and you have to want to be engaged. And you have to not allow yourself to be apathetic, because the world has set you up to be apathetic. And that apathy is killing our people. So if you leave with any one point today, I hope it's that I will push back. I'm not going to let this country be apathetic about the plight of contemporary Indigenous people. Thank you so much.
Now we'll be taking questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and then hopefully we'll get to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the data. I've been looking for something like this. I'm working with a group that is developing a land acknowledgement statement. And I'm recognizing that without actions, without involvement from Indigenous peoples, they're just words on another plaque. And it's proven difficult in Southeast Michigan in particular because we did such a good job as settlers colonizing the state of Michigan, pushed out a lot from Southeast Michigan. So my question is, and this goes to the grad students as well, how do I find Indigenous peoples that are living among us to participate in what we're doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's kind of a good question, but it might be better for other people. Most of my career has been, I came here and then 4 months after I got here, there was a pandemic. So I have not had an opportunity to really get to know Michigan. But it is something I've had the opportunity to talk with a few tribal leaders, but mostly in the Upper Peninsula. And so, I don't know the answer to that here in Ann Arbor. There is a student organization that has been growing and very active. There's Native faculty on campus, and there's an Indigenous leadership group of faculty and staff who've been working with the university to try to develop a land acknowledgement. And there's been a lot of pushback, I think myself included, and I think we chatted about it before we started. I have a lot of issue with land acknowledgements, and not that I don't think we should do them, but I think that they're sort of the modern, like, yay, I get to feel better about myself because I acknowledge the Indigenous people. And I want more than that, right? I don't want Michigan to just do a land acknowledgement and then not truly acknowledge that. I mean, University of Michigan is on land forcibly ceded, right? So it wasn't a choice. And then in the treaty of which University of Michigan emerges, in the treaty is the university agrees to educate the Indigenous children of the state. And we have absolutely not done that. It's almost like we absolutely have failed at that mission. And so, I want this university to come up with action items. What are we going to do to give Indigenous kids in this state a better chance to come here? Which means we have to intervene early. There have been really novel and unique attempts in other states to build relationships between large universities that are like ours, where we have essentially taken the land of the Indigenous people. So, I do know that there are some pretty active Indigenous groups in the area. So, but I am not your connector here. I would love to be, but I am not. So, but I do know in this third row back here, my grad students, and actually the fourth row too of students. So, maybe you can grab them after and see what they've picked up. Thank you.
Yes, I think I'm going to disagree with you considerably. I really can't see how Indigenous peoples are really a natural group. There's Hopis, there's Navajo, Lakota, Apache, so on and so on. And I'm kind of wondering, a lot of what I'm hearing from you, it sounds to me like social activism and politics rather than psychological research. And then it kind of bothers me when you toss around concepts of something saying like America responsible for genocide of American Indians, and we're a settler colony. Well, when Native Americans first came to America, which they did, they were not actually indigenous to North America. They came from Siberia. And what did they do but come here to be settlers?
I think those are political statements as well. And I do think that a lot of the work we're doing is trying to take what are the representations that are out there. And, while my view of it may seem political, it's all based in science. I mean, we pre-registered every study. I don't run the data, I have students who do it. And we have students who code data that are blind to the hypotheses being tested. So, there's all of these studies are published, and many of them in some of the most high ranking journals in the field of psychology. And so, you might not like the argument, but the reality is this very much is a settler colony. And it is because there was a group that was there that was pushed out. There was nobody here that got pushed out. And I think we're talking about a difference of maybe, depending on what theory you believe, 10,000 years ago relative to a couple hundred years ago. And so, I think that there are a number of ways in which we can push back against the argument.
A lot of controversy, real controversy.
Does anybody else have a question?
So as a non-native white woman, not in academia, that's looking for concrete ways to be able to help this movement, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really like working against the apathy. So teaching more, if you're a teacher, if you have opportunities to engage, it's really teaching a more accurate history. For the most part, a number of issues that are taught in our public schools are not steeped in reality. And in fact, there's very good evidence that if you take, for example, Christopher Columbus was a brutal colonizer. Really horrible to the people in Hispaniola. And he, we hold him up and we do this 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and we don't own the horrific things that he did. And in fact, he was jailed in his time for the horrible things that he did. And that never gets taught in schools. And so it's really important that we teach more accurate history and that we become consumers of truth so that we can have greater compassion among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And it's really about respect, right? It's about how can we have a conversation if we're starting that conversation from there. I think there are lots of other ways to be allies. There are groups out there, so we're not the moccasins on the ground, right? We just do the work. But the moccasins on the ground who are out there doing the activism, who are out there creating the art, who are working with Hollywood to get more accurate representations into mainstream society. Many of them you can donate to. I mean, there's lots of different ways to get involved. But I think starting by educating yourself, you can like some of these organizations that are putting out information all the time about amazing things Native people are doing across the country. And so just knowing about them is one way that we can, push back, right? Sorry. Right? Instead of not knowing about the famous Native people, we know about them. Reservation Dogs, Rutherford Falls. I mean, there are a bunch of new movies coming out. I mean, all of them are Indigenous people's attempts to be seen and to have their voices heard. And so really being a consumer, paying attention. I've watched Reservation Dogs. For me, having grown up on the reservation, that it really connects to my experience. But I've also watched it with non-natives. And it's interesting because what my friends are picking up are totally different than what I'm picking up. And so it leads to really great conversations about, the experiences of contemporary Native people. So I don't know if that's helpful, but there are definitely places I would start.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit more about you mentioned have the name Indigenous Futures. And obviously, if people aren't here, they don't have access to the future. So knowing they're here is important. But what is sort of they're Americans, they have access to the future. Is there any further equity piece or further looking forward piece that has come with that name?
Indigenous
Futures.
Oh, no, it was the name of the project. So the Indigenous Futures survey came about as a collaborative project. So it was very much a community-based project where we worked with different organizations and through that built a consortium of like 60 university Native student organizations, 40, I mean, they're just like organizations, 100 tribes, and got everyone to get involved in getting the survey out to their community. And the focus of the survey was really about what is the future that you want people to hear? What do you want people to know about your experience? So we asked them lots of survey questions about their experiences, about representations, about how their family is faring during the pandemic, about their community, leadership in their community. So that but it's all very much like what is happening right now. What do you think what are your greatest needs? So.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. So my question has two parts. The first part is, could you share a little more detail on how you're able to collect such large samples and shatter previous records? And my second part is, for all the researchers in the room, what advice would you have for researchers who also seek to obtain rather large samples of populations that are oftentimes difficult to recruit and sample in the first place?
Community engagement. I mean, it really is the key. If you had asked me 10 years ago if I thought I could collect these kinds of data samples, not in a million years. But it really came about through conversations with Indigenous people across the country doing different things. And what being a researcher has done is given me the opportunity to meet and engage with different types of philanthropic leaders, tribal leaders, owners of tribal companies, tribal lawyers. And it was through those, so there was a consortium that came together around this issue. Like, what does it mean? So we met in 2015. What does it mean for us to truly give voice to the experiences of contemporary Native people? And so, we started in this one meeting that was just a room full of sort of who's who in Indian country. And from there, we built out and we had people who reached out to different tribes. We just built a responsible way of engaging. And so we actually got to a point where through our different partners, we could send out a request for data and get 3,500 in a week. And I mean, it is truly unheard of, but it really came about through community collaboration. And I think for some groups, what is nice is among Indigenous people, there are groups for whom academics and activists do not talk, right? Like they see themselves as existing in different worlds, and that's not true for Indigenous people. I mean, there's a lot more conversation that's happening because we know that the issues are so different. And so it doesn't mean we always agree. And it doesn't mean it doesn't lead to some really interesting conversations. But, we've worked really well together. That is how we came about this. I did not do it myself. We were just the research arm of it. And, people trusted us. And so, we've worked hard to maintain that trust and to be really transparent. So when I said like, we do actually like, engage in the process of open science. We work hard to, pre-register because we want the data to go out there, and we want to pay tribute to every Indigenous person who filled out that survey. And so a lot of it for us is actually constantly trying to reveal sort of the different experiences of different people. Now, you can't do this, right? Like, I'm trying to make a broader argument here that colonization is still happening. And it's happening psychologically through erasure and dehumanization. But there's a whole bunch of issues that we're trying to put papers out on, reports on. Our team has been working really hard to pay tribute and honor the people who shared their voice with us. Yeah, thank you.
Hi there. I am a computer science researcher, as a graduate student at Michigan, and my work is actually in AI fairness. So it kind of thinks about how do we make AI more fair and representative for marginalized groups. And so kind of touch a little bit on kind of the data element. And I'm kind of curious to ask, how do you go about addressing that lack of data, in both public and private data sets? Like, the visibility is just not there, right? It's not available. Yeah. And if it's there, it's such a small, marginalized amount where like you probably shouldn't be trying to extrapolate predictive insights from this kind of data set. So I guess, how do you kind of think about that, try to, I guess, address it in some ways, but also kind of think about privacy as well, and how you don't, you need inclusion, but it has to be the right inclusion, versus it can just end up being more pervasive. Yeah. So how do you kind of weigh these various things to kind of address the issue?
So I feel like you're hitting on like 20 topics there. So the question is, where do we start? I think early on in my career, it was about pushing back against what we define as good science, and really trying to think about, like, there's a paper that recently came out showing that there's not huge differences between the results of convenience samples versus randomly collected samples. And, but for a long time, you have to go into Indian country to get large samples of natives, and that was held against us in science. And so, thinking about like, where are we pushing back? When are we pushing back? When is it important to say that the sample is Navajo? And when is it okay to say that we're talking about an Indigenous population, right? And some of this is stuff that I think we're still developing. I've been part of a group with Indigenous Wellness and Research Center at the University of Washington, and we collected like 13,000 subjects on a COVID study that was funded by the American Psychological Association. And it really, like, we had so many long conversations about, who's native, what's native, like, what do we think? Like, how are we deciding, like, when it's a bot and when, anytime you pay people, like, we have all these like new modern problems that emerge, and how do we figure those things out? And so I think across the research process, really, we're kind of making it as we go. Like, we're having to develop and be really intentional about our science. So I personally don't go out and march in the street. I really am someone who just does science, and we put out papers, and most of the time, I'm in my office or behind my laptop, and I do that work, and I'm writing, and then I give it away. And fortunately, now there are other people who can take it and run with it. And so, we need more voice. So you're right. Like, there are so many instances where you know, we have a sample of 200 Native people. Can we draw anything from that? Like, that's a really tough sample. And then it's like often like, how many ways can we break that data set down and feel like we're not going to run into a type 1 error? You know, so we just have all of these different kinds of methodological considerations that we have to consider all the time. I don't know. I mean, I just feel like I could write a paper about your question. So yes.
I'm curious to know, like, how do you weigh that against your, you know, your paper and your presentation about omission, right? Is it better to omit or, like, yeah, I guess how would you
misrepresent?
Yeah, and versus misrepresentation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there are, you know, they account for different variants in the studies, but I actually think they're both equally problematic. They're just problematic in different ways. So I think misrepresentation is just another way we dehumanize, right? We stereotype groups and you know, we see them as a monolithic group through that stereotype. Omission is very much, we aren't even going to talk about you. And so I think one feels a bit more like erasure and another feels a bit more like dehumanizing, but yet omitting is also dehumanizing. So, you know, I think there is overlap in the issues. Can I really say which is more damaging? You know, I think they're both really problematic. So, and I think the data really supports that. And, you know, they both individually are predicting things like suicide ideation. So both together and separate, they are predicting.
Thank you, Stephanie. I wanted please to ask maybe a secret, Indian secret. Kind of, it's going around the earth, you know, how we're gonna love the earth, and you know, there's 8 billion of us. So like, what would be the secret, you know, how to kind of, everybody needs to be careful of feeding and how we could love the earth.
So are you like, how do we all get along? How do we move forward together?
No, I'm just saying that, you know, like, kind of, America's a strong country, you know, like cares for, you know, the weak. During pandemic, I kind of, it was so heartwarming when you see, you know, somebody sharing ventilators or the masks, you know, countries, you know, how can we keep each other, you know, we just kind of, I just was wondering, as a culture, you know, like, you know, there are 8 billion of us and we all kind of need to support each other. What do you think, you know, like any, what is the secret of kind of, you know, somebody kind of is thinking that all this world is just only the money, what matters. I just kind of wanted to know, like, from the community, like.
Well, I mean, I think our ancestors would say it's all about relationship. And I mean, everything starts with relationship. We make school better for children when they have positive relationships. We make going through struggles with addiction or trauma better when we can build relationships. And I think intergroup relations, like the contact literature, real contact, not just being in a room together, but like really getting to know each other in deep and meaningful ways. Like our families go on vacation together, kind of deep and meaningful, that it's about relationship. And I think across all of, you know, the world, I think often when we disagree, it's that we don't know how to hear each other and we don't know how to listen. And so I think a lot of that starts with relationship. And so if we hold up that word and really stand behind it, I think that's how we get there.
Hey, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I just had 2 comments. One was about the AI question, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I was thinking that just the fact that you say we are having a problem getting enough data to say something rather than not saying anything was probably the way to go, just to have it upfront that it's not invisible, that we haven't properly gathered data on this side, so be aware that there are failings and shortcomings in it. The other thing I was going to talk about was a language issue of revitalizing language and keeping languages alive because they're dying out very quickly. Also in some areas being revived very beautifully. But it's really something that I think there's a great example in Wales So I come from England, so I heard about the issue or knew about the issue in Wales, where the language had almost died out. And after burning down a few tourists' homes and having rather a lot of angry activities, something was done about it. And they managed to create radio stations and TV programs. And that's a simple technological fix that you can just spend money on and it can happen. So it's not hugely complicated, but it is obviously something that there has to be political pressure and political will for, but it can be done. And now it's the majority language there. Schools are taught in Welsh. English people who go live there have to learn Welsh. So it's completely revived. It's an astonishing success story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.